can be single, I think a husband or deacon should be able to be single. I don't think anything in the Bible takes away from that. Verse 33, but he that is married careth for the things of the world, how he may please his wife. Okay, if a man's wife or if a man's child is sick, if a man's wife or child is in need, then what must a good man do? A good man must forsake all in order to take care of his family. A married man is under an obligation to take care of his wife and family and to please his wife and family. And that is a wonderful thing. But if you're not married yet, it's an optional thing for you. Paul is simply reminding the single that this obligation is not mandatory. The obligation one has to a spouse doesn't have to be you. It's not mandatory for you to be married. Verse 34, there is a difference also between a wife and a virgin. The unmarried woman careth for the things of the Lord, that she may be holy, both in body and in spirit. But she that is married careth for the things of the world, how she may please her husband. You know, I have known Christian young ladies who felt called to go to the mission field. I've heard them say, I plan on being a missionary to Mozambique. And then somewhere along the line, guess what happened? They fell in love instead, is what happened. They fell in love with some guy who was the most wonderful Christian guy you'd ever meet. Guess what, though? He didn't feel called to go to Mozambique. They were so sure God called them to the mission field, but marriage kept them from it. I'm not saying that God didn't call that woman to get married instead of going to... I'm not saying any of that. All I'm saying is I've known ladies who felt called to do X, Y, or Z, and when they got married, when they fell in love, they ended up not doing that. I know it feels extremely limiting. It doesn't feel that way. It would be extremely limiting if you were a Christian young lady who feels called to be a missionary to Japan. If that is truly what God has called you to do, I know how limiting it would be that basically you could only date guys who also feel called to be a missionary to Japan. That's very hard. That's very limiting. But Paul says here, keep in mind, until you're married, you don't have to be. Marriage is not mandatory. I think of another case. I think of a man I know, a man I used to know, but he felt called to be a missionary, and he and his whole family up and went off to the mission field, and his family absolutely could not handle living on the mission field, and they ended up returning back to the United States. Obviously, this man did the right thing. Once you have a family, you have to take care of that family. But the point that Paul is basically saying here to such a case is this. If the guy didn't have a family, well, then he could have gone and been that missionary, see? Having a family limits you, and it's the most wonderful, happy limitation you'll ever have upon you. But it is nevertheless a limitation. And until you're married, it doesn't have to be your limitation. Verse 35, and this I speak for your own benefit, not that I may cast a snare upon you, but for that which is comely, and that ye may attend upon the Lord without distraction. He uses the word snare there. I want you to think of a snare as being like a net. Paul is basically saying single Christians are not under the net of singleness, that they cannot possibly escape and be married, but rather a married man is under the net of marriage. And even though it is a beautiful, happy net, it is nevertheless a net that you cannot escape once you are in it. A single person can always still get married, right? But he keeps all the cards in his hand, while a married man, no way around it, has fewer cards to play. Okay, now we come to another reason for a Christian to stay single. This one is a bit more peculiar to us, and this applies to the girls and not so much to the guys. The promise of the fathers. Okay, parental authority over a child, especially a daughter. In biblical times, whether it was Jewish culture or whether it was Greek culture, parental authority over a child, a daughter in particular, it was like unquestioned. It was like virtually absolute until the child got married. It was like you have absolute power over that girl until she becomes somebody's wife. It's just basically how it was for dads. Marriages were, back then, normally arranged by the parents. And the concept of a dowry could be seen as nothing more than selling your children away in marriage. And fathers gave their daughters to whomever they would. This does not mean that the daughter was given no say-so ever, but it does mean that back then the daughter's say-so, it was not the final say-so. Now, to say the least, the father and daughter both had to sign off on a marriage or else it did not happen. And so that's why still today we have the formality of a father giving away his daughter at a wedding. Now, some fathers back in those days, 2,000 years ago in the Roman Empire, some Christian fathers had dedicated their daughters to perpetual virginity in order to serve God more devoutly. And there should be no doubt, I say, that the death of the father should always free the girl to do whatever she wanted after that. Well, it takes very little imagination to realize that back then you would have had girls who had been dedicated to lifelong chastity when they were infants. But now that your little girl is all grown up, well, she's got something to say about that, Dad, and they want to be married. They didn't feel the Lord calling them to being perpetually single. And so now these fathers that Paul addresses in these verses, those dads they feel like they're in a bit of a bind here. What are fathers to do? Because on the one hand, I made this wonderful commitment back when my daughter was a baby, but now my daughter is so miserable. She wants to get married. Okay, verse 36. But if any man think that he behaveth uncomely toward his virgin, stop right there. His virgin, that's his daughter, and behaveth uncomely means, maybe he made a boo-boo when he dedicated her to perpetual virginity. Verse 36, if she pass the flower of her age, stop right there. This means now she grows up. She becomes a mature woman, both biologically and spiritually. Verse 36, and need so require. Stop right there. That means, you know what? She really is meant for marriage. She really is designed for marriage. It would probably include just like a desperate desire to be married, as well as the fact that she would make a wonderful wife. Verse 36 goes on, let him, that's the father, do what he will. He sinneth not. Let them marry, he says. So Paul is letting a dad in that bind, he's letting him know he doesn't need to feel bad about letting his daughter marry, seeing as, number one, his heart was in the right place when he made that commitment years ago. Number two, it was a commitment that involved somebody else. So it's really not fair to force someone else to do what you committed them to do. And number three, he could not have foreseen back when she was a baby his daughter's, spiritual makeup, the woman that she would grow up to be, one that so desperately wants to get married. Verse 37, nevertheless, he that standeth steadfast in his heart. This means that, if you're a dad who has not changed his mind, verse 37, having no necessity, that means the situation really doesn't call for it. She really doesn't have this desperate need to be married. Verse 37, but hath power over his own will. That means his motives are still pure. And hath so decreed in his heart. That means, yes, the dad is still committed to his earlier promise, that he will keep his virgin, doeth well. So, only the daughter's unwillingness to keep a vow, or at least her absolute misery, ought to cause that dad to change his mind. Outside of that, keeping your daughter unmarried might just be a wonderful thing. Verse 38, so then, he that giveth her in marriage doeth well, and he that giveth her not in marriage doeth better. Marriage to the right person can be the greatest thing in the world. But the one who remains unmarried does hold a very special position. It may not be for everybody, but everyone should consider whether or not it might just be for them. Now, Paul will give one more reason to stay single before he then moves on to eating meat that's been offered to idols, as we talked about this morning. And that is the earthly permanence of marriage. The fact that marriage is lifelong. The fact that marriage is binding. Only in very few cases can a marriage be annulled. And Paul has talked about those things. An unbelieving spouse leaving, adultery, and death. The fact that marriage cannot be simply undone, the fact it is permanent, the fact that it is binding, that is a legitimate reason to maybe never enter into it in the first place. It matters very much, the choice to get married and who you marry. Second to receiving Christ as your Savior, it's the most important decision you'll ever make, whether to be married and who to marry. Verse 39, the wife is bound by the law as long as her husband liveth. But if her husband be dead, she is at liberty to be married to whom she will, only in the Lord. So widowhood, or widowerhood as well, is being held up in this verse as usually the only thing that can end a marriage. So getting married is a big, big deal, which might be a good reason for some of us to not do it. At the same time, Paul is pointing out that the widow may get remarried as long as the new spouse is also, quote, in the Lord. Now, we need to keep in mind here, earlier death was more common 2,000 years ago. Meaning 2,000 years ago, it was just even more common for people to die at any age. Just to give that context there. Verse 40, but she is happier if she so abide after my judgment, saying that the Christian whose spouse has passed away might just be happier if that Christian stays single after that, after my judgment, he says. And I think also that I have the Spirit of God. Okay, folks, let me just sum this up here. To read everything you and I just read might just lead you to a certain conclusion. And that conclusion it might lead you to might just be this. You really would not have wanted the Apostle Paul to officiate your wedding. That if the Apostle Paul were to officiate your wedding, you might get the idea that it might go something like this. Do you take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife? I do. Are you sure? Are you sure you want to do this? Son, you're throwing your life away. You don't have to do this. Please stop. Okay, you're all okay. Well, if anyone has any reason why these two should not be married, speak now or forever hold your peace. I'm giving this 10 minutes. I want somebody to say something. Please, please stop this. Okay. You might get the idea it would go something like that, but that's not the truth. That's not the truth. Paul's all for marriage. But Paul is magnifying the virtues of being single. And obviously marriage and being married and having a family is promoted and celebrated and glorified in the church as it should be. And so, how wonderful it can be to be single gets its day in the sun here in 1 Corinthians chapter 7. It deserves that much of a place. The question is this: are you serving God as best as you can serve Him? Are you honoring God as you should be, whether you are a married man or whether you are a single man? Even though he doesn't emphasize it in this chapter, there are also ways in which you can serve God that are of eternal consequence as a married man that you can't as a single person as well. Both have unparalleled blessings. The question is not which one you are right now. The question is, are you utilizing your potential to be of service to God with your life? That is what it all boils down to. And tonight, if you can say that whether it's you as a married person or a single person or any other specific about your situation in your life, you're not using what you've got for God. Whatever that is, whatever your situation, whatever your talent, whatever your position, whatever it may be, you're not using that for God. And that's what you want to do. As we stand to our feet for this hymn of invitation, as the Lord has spoken to your heart, you come forward.